My name is Nicola, and for the DES304 module I worked on what I call the Memory Diary, a puzzle game in which the player can relive memories and solve puzzles by doing so. The game is inspired by the TV show Westworld, in which when certain characters try to remember something, they do so perfectly. They can relive their memories, they can experience them as if they were actually living the moment. I tried to take inspiration from several pieces of entertainment listed somewhere around here, and I refined my mechanic by brainstorming mostly, but also confronting it with friends and asking for feedback. The game went through several stages of conception. I started with a third-person shooter that will let you rewind time to predict the placement of enemies, and I ended up with a puzzle game in which the player can actually relive memories and take photos of them. And the actual mechanic is a diary, a collection of memories that are portrayed as photos, in which the player can move around, connect, or take notes upon. So in the end, each memory functioned as a self-contained scene that the player can play, and each scene contains several pieces of information. So in each memory the time goes on even without the player, characters go on with their life, there is a fixed series of events that can happen in different places, and the player needs to be very attentive and actually explore the area and look the right place at the right time to find what they're looking for. To sum it up, it looks like the ship log in other wilds, where new entries are formed when the player explores something and maybe discovers an interesting fact, but the difference is that the player will need to form and maintain these entries themselves. So they're not formed automatically by the system, the player needs to actually build them and take notes and acknowledge what they've discovered. So this is how the final build works. The player wakes up in a room and needs to find a way out, since the door is locked. They can start to pick up objects and inspect them, but there's no key anywhere. At a certain point, while interacting with the camera, the first memory is triggered and the player is transported in a past version of the room. In this memory, the grey painting fell from the wall, and behind, an empty hole can be seen. Having discovered this information, the player can now take a picture and they will leave the memory. Once in the present, the picture is now available in their diary, and it can be moved around or commented with personal notes, in case the player needs to add some. They now know that behind the grey painting hides a secret hole, and if they interact with it, it opens, revealing a key that can be collected to open the door and solve the introductory puzzle. Once they're outside the first room, they can start exploring the house. There are several things to interact with, like objects and notes, but right now I'll focus on the solution of the final puzzle. There is a memory that is triggered when the player is walking up the stairs. A memory in which they can clearly see a secret path hidden below the pavement. They can talk with the character present in the scene and try to go downstairs, in which they find a door that is unfortunately locked. They can only take a picture and again leave. Later, when exploring the house, they can find a note in another memory telling them that the secret to opening the door is hidden below a large vase in the main bedroom, but when they go there, the vase is not present. Another note in the kitchen tells them that, unfortunately, the vase was recently broken. Clearly, the only solution is to relive a memory set in the bedroom, and when the player does so, the vase is present. Under it, the solution to the puzzle, which is interacting with a specific book in the library and then running towards the stairs. The player can do so, and the secret door will open, allowing the player to continue the game. This is then the core idea of my mechanic, a collection of memories and notes that aid the player in connecting scattered pieces of information and solve puzzles. I tested it with the help of friends, and in doing so I received precious feedback. After each playtest, I majorly redefined the input system, which was the most obscure thing about the mechanic. Unfortunately, I couldn't test the puzzles enough, because they were introduced very late in development, but I did manage to make a few tests, Mostly, they're the main reason why I introduced sound clues in the game, which now help the player greatly when taking major actions or solving major puzzles. The puzzles should be tested enough, I think, so I will say they're still open for evaluation. In the end, I'm very happy with what I achieved by coding. I only learned to code this summer, and this is the most complex project that I've worked on so far, considering that there's a lot of management to do with information, loading and saving memories, loading and saving pictures, loading and saving notes, making sure each memory is attributed to the same note and picture, yada yada yada. So I think I did a lot of good job on that end. I also really liked working on smaller mechanics like the camera or the notes and the various UI system that I had to implement. Some of the code is put together with duct tape. You don't want to take a look at the player, for example, but a lot of it is actually pretty well coded, for my standard at least. For example, the memory manager does everything, and other objects only need to call the memory manager to load, unload the memory, or take notes from the database and load them and stuff like that. So I feel like I've made great steps on that end, because programming used to be a huge turn-off point for me, something that would prevent me to work on anything because I couldn't manage to get out of the tutorial hell. But now it's something that I look forward to, it's something that I actually await with eagerness and that I'm happy to confront. So that's pretty good. I can achieve much more today, and the actual prototype only took 2 weeks to put together, but this is where things got out of hand. So once I was done with the prototype, I had to put together puzzles. I had to test the mechanic, and I lost control because instead of white boxing puzzles, instead of putting together fast concepts to understand what I was working with, I ended up working on a level. I ended up working on something that had a narrative, a structure, without actually planning for it first or failing fast for it first. So that took a lot of time because I had to scrap a lot of content that took time to put together. I think that's what I failed mostly, because in the end I think the mechanic is good and I liked putting it together, but there's no true proving ground for it. So I believe the prototype failed to capture the most interesting aspect of the mechanic, and it doesn't work well as a proof of concept because of that. The final level doesn't take full advantage of the mechanic. It makes only superficial use of it because there are not enough memories and notes to be taken. There's not enough information for the player to remember so as to make the whole note-taking dynamic viable. So at this moment, it's useless. The major lesson for next time is that I should not be so eager to start working on something that feels like progress but actually isn't, and spend more time with my mechanic. Get to know it, get to understand it, and whiteboxing, making fast levels, making fast puzzles, stuff that can be thrown out later, as I did with the actual level, but it's not long to put together, and it's actually helpful to the understanding of the mechanic. I'm working to build an understanding of the mechanic, and I should keep that in mind. A lot of this problem is also part of scoping. Scope is difficult to rationalize, especially with little experience as I have, but I could have done a better job at it by evaluating my skills a bit better. I focused on an idea that I thought would take me a lot of time to put together, but it actually took me 2 weeks, and after that it required a lot of content. Like, it's not system heavy, it's content heavy. Content that, of course, I didn't have neither the experience nor the budget to put together in a convincing way. So also for next time, I should try to give more consideration to what kind of labor a mechanic requires or a prototype requires, and make sure it actually aligns with my experience and my capabilities. That's something I think that will get better in time, the more experience I gain and the more I fail. So I'm looking forward to that. So in the end, I believe the mechanic is pretty interesting, but the prototype fails in capturing it because there are not enough pieces of information that the player needs to take notes about for it to make interesting. There's only 3 pictures or memories, and you can solve puzzles immediately. Like, every time you make a connection, that's it. You need to make it and then forget about it. So taking notes is pretty useless right now. I do think that the mechanic is interesting, and in the proper context it could shine. I believe that taking notes is something that I'm fascinated towards, and it's still a valid idea, but the prototype doesn't make a good job at showing it. If I had time, there's a few ways in which I could improve the prototype. One, I would include more puzzles. So more memories, more puzzles, more pieces of information to take notes about. So the player needs to remember stuff and not just connect it immediately. 2, I will make more puzzles concurrent, so the player will need to solve more puzzles at once. And I will space out the discovery of each piece of each puzzle, so as to encourage the player taking notes about each piece and be sure to not forget them. I will require each solution more time to get to, so that, again, the player is encouraged to take notes about them. Finally, as I originally intended, I would focus more on characters. I really like the idea of the player running into characters and having like a first impression of them, but then the more they explore memories, the more they contextualize their actions and the more they can understand them. Something like Memento, which is a good inspiration for this mechanic. I think I will draw a lot of inspiration from that. And that's it. That's what I will do to improve it. This is my mechanic. Again, I think it fails, but I think the prototype fails. But I think the mechanic is quite interesting in itself. So I might consider working on it more and see where that leads me.